A broken Delta Force operator went to the edge of the world to silence the screams of his own memories. But during a relentless mountain storm, the war he tried to bury found him anyway. A German shepherd, shivering and clinging to a fragile thread of life, collapsed on his porch, its body bearing the jagged, surgical marks of deliberate human cruelty. The dog wasn't just a stray, it was a messenger. Its intelligent, amber eyes were a map, wordlessly commanding the warrior to follow it back into the fog-shrouded rainforest toward a dark secret and a legacy of betrayal 50 years in the making. Before we reveal the secret hidden inside that cabin, tell us where you are watching from today. If stories of courage and the unbreakable bond between man and dog move you, please subscribe and join our community. The cabin was perched on a jagged granite spine of the Cascade Mountains, a lonely sentinel of cedar and stone that seemed to shiver against the unrelenting fury of the North Pacific storm. Inside, Calder Rain sat in a chair he'd fashioned from salvaged timber, his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the door. It was a habit born of a decade in Delta Force, a tactical reflex that civilian life had failed to erode. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and old gun oil, the only sense that anchored him to the present. Outside, the wind howled through the pines like the ghosts of 1,000 fallen soldiers, but for Calder, the true noise was the silence. In the quiet, the memories were no longer just thoughts, they were physical weights. He could still feel the phantom heat of the desert sun on his neck and the acrid, metallic tang of cordite in the back of his throat. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the narrow, dust-choked alleys of Kandahar, the radio chatter screaming in his ear. He saw the flash of the IED, felt the concussive force that had shattered the air, and heard the final, choked breath of Miller, his teammate, his brother, whose life had slipped through Calder's fingers during that botched hostage rescue. Calder had fled to this wilderness to drown out those whispers, hoping the raw power of nature would be louder than the guilt. He had built this fortress of solitude to protect the world from his brokenness and himself from the world's pity. He lived by a clock that didn't exist, measuring time in the consumption of firewood and the rising of the mist. He was a man waiting for a war that had already ended, unaware that tonight, the mission would finally find its way to his door. The scream of the wind was suddenly punctuated by a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a frantic, rhythmic scratching against the heavy cedar door. Calder was on his feet before his mind could even register the movement, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the knife at his belt. He didn't open the door immediately. He waited, listening with the honed patience of a man who had spent a lifetime in the dark. Another scratch, weaker this time, followed by a low, guttural whimper that bypassed his tactical brain and struck straight at his gut. When he finally threw the bolt and hauled the door open against the gale, the rain lashed into the entryway like buckshot. There, collapsed across the threshold, was a mass of matted black and tan fur. A German shepherd, its ribs heaving in shallow, desperate cycles, lay shivering in a pool of diluted crimson. The dog's ears were flat against its skull, and its eyes, wide and clouded with agony, searched Calder's face with a haunting intelligence. The ghosts vanished as the operator took over. Calder didn't see a pet, he saw a casualty. He knelt in the driving rain, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a Delta medic on a hot extraction. As he lifted the dog and carried it toward the warmth of the hearth, he felt the sticky heat of active arterial bleeding. Setting the animal on a clean tarp, Calder ignored the thunder and reached for his go-bag. The silence of the room was filled with the rhythmic tearing of gauze and the clink of hemostats. Working under the amber glow of a kerosene lamp, he flushed the wounds with antiseptic, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline. It was as he was closing a jagged laceration on the dog's flank that he froze. The wound wasn't a tear from a predator's tooth or a jagged branch. It was a clean, vertical incision, the kind made by a scalpel. He looked into the dog's eyes and saw not just pain, but a plea. The mission hadn't just found him, it had bled all over his floor. By the time the storm began to subside into a low, rhythmic thrum against the roof, the German shepherd was stable, its breathing deep and melodic. Calder sat back on his heels, his hands stained with antiseptic and the ghost of the dog's heat. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, but his eyes never left the animal's flank. In the sterile, high-pressure environments of Delta Force, he had seen what shrapnel did to flesh, and he knew the messy, jagged path of a bullet. This was neither. As he leaned in with the kerosene lamp, the amber light revealed the true horror of the dog's journey. Along the ribs and down the hind leg, the wounds were frighteningly precise. They were clean, straight-edged incisions that spoke of a steady hand and a sharp blade, deliberate, calculated cruelty that felt like a cold finger tracing Calder's spine. There were also small, circular burns, perfectly spaced, that could only have come from a pressurized heat source. This wasn't the work of a wild animal or a random accident. This was the signature of a monster who took his time. A familiar, icy stillness settled over Calder, the frozen state of his grief suddenly hardening into the cold steel of an operator on a scent. The ghosts that usually whispered of his failures were silenced by a new, sharper sound, the internal click of a safety being moved to fire. He looked at the brass tag on the dog's collar, now cleaned of grime, which simply read Shadow. Rowan Maddox, whoever he was, had left a trail of blood that led straight to Calder's door, and in the world of Delta Force, you didn't just survive an ambush, you counterattacked. The dog wasn't just a patient anymore, it was a witness. Calder realized then that he wasn't just hiding in these woods, he was sharing them with a predator who considered torture a pastime. As the week progressed, the mountain air grew thin and biting, but inside the cabin, a transformation was taking place. Shadow's recovery defied the odds, a testament to the dog's sheer will and Calder's meticulous care. The German shepherd no longer lay prone by the hearth. He had regained his strength, moving with a silent, rhythmic grace that mirrored Calder's own footfalls. However, Shadow didn't seek the comforts of a typical pet. He didn't beg for scraps or lounge in the warmth. Instead, he took up a position at the north-facing window, his body rigid, his ears forward, staring into the dense wall of the Douglas firs with a chilling, singular focus. Calder watched him while cleaning his rifle, the familiar click-clack of the bolt action providing the only soundtrack to the heavy silence. He recognized that look. It was the gaze of a sentry on a forward operating base, a soldier who knew the enemy was still out there. Every time the wind rattled the glass or a branch snapped in the distance, Shadow's hackles would rise, and he would cast a meaningful, amber-eyed glance back at Calder. It wasn't a plea for protection, it was a summons. The dog was waiting for the operator to realize that the medical phase was over, and the tactical phase had begun. The ghosts of the botched rescue mission seemed to retreat into the shadows of the cabin, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a new objective. Calder felt the old itch in his palms, the familiar, heavy pull of duty. Shadow wasn't looking for a master. He was looking for a partner to return to the site of the crime. The dog's silent vigil at the window was a constant, wordless reminder that while they were safe behind cedar walls, someone else was still trapped in the dark. The warrior and the messenger were now synchronized, two broken souls finding a common purpose in the mist. The transition from civilian drift to operational readiness happened with a chilling, practiced precision. Calder moved through the small cabin, no longer seeing a home, but a staging area. He pulled a heavy, dust-covered pelican case from beneath his cot, the latches snapping open with a metallic finality that echoed through the room. Inside lay the tools of a trade he had tried to renounce, his camouflage fatigues, a rugged tactical vest, and his primary rifle. As he ran a cloth over the cold steel of the barrel, the ghosts of the past didn't whisper of failure. They stood in the corner of his mind, watching him prepare for the only thing that could justify their loss. Shadow watched from the window, his tail giving a single sharp thump against the floorboards as Calder donned his camouflage. The fabric felt like a second skin, the familiar weight of the tactical vest pressing against his chest like a long-lost armor. He checked his sidearm, the slide of the Sig Sauer racking with a crisp, lethal sound. Every movement was economy, no wasted energy, no hesitation. He packed a compact trauma kit, extra magazines, and a high-intensity torch, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 100 midnight insertions. He looked into the mirror, and for the first time in years, the man staring back wasn't a survivor hiding from the world. He was an operator with a mission. The emotional freeze that had paralyzed his heart began to thaw into a focused, icy resolve. He wasn't going into the forest to find peace. He was going to find justice for the messenger and the secret it carried. With a final check of his gear, Calder looked at Shadow and nodded. The dog stood, his upright ears twitching, ready to lead the way into the fog. The hunt had officially begun. Stepping out of the cabin was like crossing a threshold back into a world of kinetic stakes. The storm had left the rainforest dripping and heavy, the air thick with a pervasive, primeval mist that swallowed the light. Shadow didn't hesitate. He moved with a purposeful, limping gait toward the tree line, his head low and his senses dialed into a frequency Calder knew only too well. This wasn't a walk. It was a movement to contact. As they pushed deeper into the emerald gloom, the modern world fell away, replaced by the crushing silence of the old-growth timber. Shadow navigated the terrain with an uncanny precision, weaving through thickets of devil's club and over moss-slicked logs that would have stalled any casual hiker. Calder followed, his boots making almost no sound on the damp needle cast. Every few hundred yards, the dog would pause by a specific tree, and Calder would lean in, his tactical light revealing what the naked eye would miss. Faint, deliberate carvings etched into the bark. They weren't symbols of nature, but markers of tradecraft, notches and directional arrows hidden in the natural texture of the wood, invisible to anyone not trained to look for them. The ghosts of the desert were quiet now, replaced by the hypervigilance of the present. Calder's rifle felt like a natural extension of his arm as he scanned the ridgelines, his mind mapping the elevation and the blind spots. The path Shadow was following was a phantom trail, a ghost road that bypassed the main hiking veins of the Cascades. It was a route designed for someone who didn't want to be found, or for someone who was keeping a secret that the rest of the world had forgotten. With every mile, the air grew colder and the tension tighter. They were nearing the heart of the mystery, and the messenger was leading him straight into the mouth of the wolf. The canopy above began to thin, revealing a small, jagged clearing where a structure sat huddled against the damp earth like a dying animal. It was a dilapidated cabin, its timber rotted and gray, with windows boarded over like sightless eyes. Shadow slowed his pace, a low, vibrating growl beginning in his chest. Calder didn't need the warning. He had already transitioned into a tactical crouch, his rifle held in a ready-low position. The silence here was different. It wasn't the natural quiet of the woods, but the suffocating stillness of a place meant to hide a crime. Approaching the door, Calder saw the heavy, industrial-grade logging chain looped through the handles, secured by a padlock that looked out of place against the weathered wood. With a pair of compact bolt cutters from his vest, he snapped the link with a muted clack. He breathed out, pushed the door open, and swept the room with his muzzle. The interior was a tomb of dust and decay, illuminated only by thin slivers of light piercing the roof. Then he saw the movement in the corner. On a rusted iron cot sat an elderly man, his skin the color of parchment and his frame so thin it seemed the wind might shatter him. A heavy shackle was clamped around his ankle, the chain bolted directly into the floorboards. This was Elia's, the asset Shadow had nearly died to protect. As Calder approached, the man didn't cower. He looked up with a flicker of defiant intelligence in his sunken eyes. He wasn't just a victim. He was a man holding onto a secret that had cost him 50 years of freedom. The ghosts in Calder's mind fell completely silent, replaced by the singular, burning heat of a new objective. The rescue wasn't just a mission anymore. It was an act of war against the man who had turned this forest into a cage. The heavy, metallic snap of a dry branch echoed through the clearing, sharper than a gunshot. Calder didn't flinch. He simply melted into the shadows behind the cabin door, his rifle transitioning to a high-ready position. Shadow's hackles rose, a silent snarl curling his lip as a sleek, high-end SUV rolled into the muddy yard, looking like a polished intruder in the primeval woods. Out stepped Rowan Maddox. He was dressed in expensive outdoor gear that had never seen a day of real labor, his face a practiced mask of corporate concern. Maddox didn't see the broken chain or the silent operator watching him. He strolled toward the cabin with the casual arrogance of a man who owned everything he looked at. "Uncle Elias," he called out, his voice smooth and dripping with a counterfeit warmth that made Calder's skin crawl. "I brought your supplies. You know, you're making it very difficult for me to take care of you." Calder stepped from the gloom, the muzzle of his rifle leveled at Maddox's chest. The predator froze, his hands twitching upward as the mask of concern shattered. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the dripping rain. But then Maddox's eyes adjusted. He saw the frozen stillness in Calder's gaze, the 1,000-yard stare of a man haunted by ghosts. A thin, oily smile returned to Rowan's lips. He realized he wasn't facing a civilian, he was facing a broken soldier. "I know your type," Maddox whispered, his voice gaining a manipulative edge. "You're one of those discarded heroes, aren't you? Lost in the fog of a war nobody cares about. You're confused, soldier. You're trespassing on private property, interfering with a family matter. Put the gun down, go back to your hole in the woods, and I'll forget I ever saw you. Don't let another man's death be on your conscience. Haven't you had enough of those?" The words were tactical strikes, aimed directly at the cracks in Calder's psyche, but Maddox had miscalculated. He thought he was talking to a victim. He didn't realize he was talking to a man who had finally found a target for his rage. Maddox's arrogance was his undoing. As he lunged forward, not with a weapon but with the desperate, flailing greed of a man losing his grip on a fortune, he struck the heavy iron table. The kerosene lantern perched on the edge teetered for a heartbeat before crashing to the rotted floorboards. A roar of orange flame erupted instantly, fed by decades of bone-dry timber and dust. The interior of the cabin transformed into a furnace of choking black smoke and searing heat. Maddox screamed, his expensive gear melting as he scrambled toward the door, completely forgetting the uncle he had come to exploit. But Calder didn't move toward the exit. He moved toward the fire. Through the shimmering wall of heat, he saw Elias, his eyes wide with a calm, terrifying acceptance of death. The shackle was still bolted to the floor, the metal already beginning to glow. Calder dropped his rifle, the weapon useless in the inferno, and drew his heavy combat knife. He wasn't trying to pick the lock. There was no time. He channeled every ounce of his Delta training into a singular, explosive burst of kinetic energy, using the knife's pommel to strike the rusted bolt in the floorboards with rhythmic, bone-jarring force. The wood, weakened by rot and now brittle from the heat, finally splintered. With the roar of the collapsing roof deafening him, Calder slung Elias over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, the elderly man's weight almost nothing against the surge of adrenaline. Shadow was a blur of black and tan, barking through the smoke, guiding them toward the shattered remains of the doorway. Just as a massive cedar beam crashed down, sealing the room in a tomb of fire, Calder leaped through the threshold. He hit the damp earth hard, shielding Elias with his own body as the cabin behind them vanished into a towering pillar of flame. The mission was no longer a theory, it was a rescue. The smoke from the cabin's remains curled into the damp morning air, a gray shroud over the site of Rowan Maddox's greed. Maddox had vanished into the tree line the moment the flames took hold, but Calder didn't care about the hunter anymore. He was focused on the survivor. Wrapped in a thermal blanket from Calder's kit, Elias sat against a mossy log, his breathing ragged but rhythmic. In his trembling hands, he clutched a leather-bound satchel Calder had snatched from the flames, the documents that were never about money or timber. As the sun began to pierce the Pacific mist, Elias pulled a single, charred photograph from the satchel. He held it out to Calder. It was a picture of a young Elias in a field jacket, standing beside a woman whose smile was as familiar to Calder as his own reflection. It was Alina, Calder's grandmother. "We were the denied ones," Elias whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Disavowed by the agency after a mission went south in '74. I stayed in these woods to keep her safe from the fallout. I promised her I'd wait until the world forgot us." The realization hit Calder with the force of a kinetic strike. The ghosts he had been fighting weren't just his fallen teammates. They were the echoes of a family legacy defined by sacrifice and silence. Elias wasn't just an asset. He was the man who had loved the woman who raised Calder, a brother-in-arms from a different era who had endured a half-century of isolation for a promise. Looking at Shadow, who sat sentinel between them, Calder felt the icy grip of his own guilt finally thaw. He wasn't a broken soldier hiding from the world. He was the final link in a chain of protectors. For the first time since the desert, the noise in his head went silent. He stood up, offered his hand to the old man, and for the first time in years, Calder Rains knew exactly where home was. Calder Rains built walls to cage his demons, but Shadow showed him that true strength isn't found in isolation. It's forged in the act of saving another. This story reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest purpose when we choose connection over hiding. If you've ever been rescued by an unexpected friendship or felt called to help when you yourself were broken, share your story below. Let's honor the shadows in our lives. Subscribe to witness more tales where courage meets compassion.